are standing right now on Roundhouse Point on Burlington's waterfront, and the reason that Steve Goodkind, who is the health officer for the city, and the city's chief engineer are standing here right now is in order to begin a discussion of the sewage problem in the city of Burlington, what the problem is, and how the city intends to solve the problem. The reason that we're standing right here is that in many ways that is a symbol. That concrete structure over there is a symbol of what the problem is. Now, we can't photograph it from here, otherwise we'd have to be out in the lake in order to do it properly. But underneath that concrete structure is essentially a tunnel, a large tunnel. And when there is an intensive rainfall in the city of Burlington, the stormwater becomes mixed with the sanitary waste. And because the volume is so great that our sewer system can't accommodate it, that waste streams directly into Lake Champlain, primarily through this antiquated structure right here. Steve, on a bad night, first of all, let me ask you, how often, during this summer, we know that the beaches were closed on a number of occasions because the waste ended up here and it migrated over to North Beach over there and then to Letty Park over there. For a start, how often during the course of the year does this overflow, combined sewer overflow, take place?
Of course, it varies year by year. It varies on the number of storms. I'll say 20 to 30 times a year. Ironically, this summer, my guess is we probably didn't have the normal amount of overflows take place, but those that did were very, very severe. We didn't have much rain this summer, but a few times it rained, they were large storms, and they caused a lot of our problems.
Okay, which resulted in the closing down of the...
Especially the storm people probably most remember, the one in July during those hottest days. That storm statistically was the kind of storm that you have, say, one time in 10 years or even less frequently. So that was a very, very intense storm.
Okay, Stephen, what is the history of this problem? How long has this problem gone on? Is it worse today than it was 20 years ago, or what?
Well, the problem has almost gone on forever. As long as Burlington has had a sewer system, which probably dates from about the middle of the 1800s, we've been dumping it in the lake. This structure that you described now is actually fairly recent. It's probably 30, 40, 50 years old. Behind these trees here is an older structure which basically did the same thing. It just allowed sewage to go directly to the lake, stormwater and sewage, in fact. In 1951, the city built the first primary wastewater treatment plant in the state, and at that point, at least some of the waste, certainly the day-to-day flow, not during storms, was being given what's called primary treatment.
And that's the plant that can't be seen, but it's right over there.
Actually, it's part of it. It's what happened is in the early 70s, the city built what's called secondary treatment. We added on another layer of treatment to what we already had and provided what is now considered the acceptable type of treatment called secondary treatment. And we provide that, again, to all our waste, except during these storms when the flows go from an average of, say, 4 million gallons a day to up to 20 or more million gallons a day. And the plant cannot handle anywhere close to that. It goes out this conduit.
Okay, why don't you do me a favor? Why don't you start from zero and talk about how the city deals with wastewater on a normal day when there's not a storm, and what happens when there is a storm, and what the problem is.
Okay. Unlike many communities in Vermont, certainly unlike most of the small towns, Burlington has a sewer system which serves almost the entire town. There are very few locations that aren't connected to the system. What happens is, obviously, when you flush the toilet, yes, you wash dishes in a sink or whatever, that water is transported by pipe into our city system. It flows by gravity, and if gravity can't do it in some areas, we actually pump it. And all of it ends up at one of our 3 wastewater plants. We have one in the north end. We have one on Riverside Avenue, which serves the university and the medical center area. And then we have our main plant, and this plant is by far the largest. This one is designed to handle 4 million gallons a day of flow. And on an average day, we do not produce that much flow. It's right now sized to be adequate.
All right, let me deal with that point for a start. For an average day, which is well over 90% of the days, I gather, we have significant capacity to deal with the normal...
That's correct. The only thing that we're aware of is this plant I mentioned was built in the 70s. There's been technological changes. There's been equipment that is worn out, and it is time to renew that plant, to overhaul it, and upgrade it slightly, and to do some planning for the future, because I think the growth of Burlington, what they projected, say, 20 or 25 years ago when they designed this, things have changed. And we want to make sure that we're prepared and we're thinking a little bit in advance. But as a basic concept, the day-to-day flows are not something that we can't handle. We are handling it. And that's the same at our East plant and the same at North plant. What happens is, though, when we get a rainstorm, and let me go back a step, actually. I mentioned these pipes that take the waste from your home and deliver it to the plant. Also, and I don't say it's by design, it seems to be more by tradition or convenience, in most areas of the part of the city served by the North plant, which includes what people think of as the north end of Burlington, the hill section, the south end, the downtown area, we have catch basins that are also connected to this same system. And that means when it rains, we're not only dealing with the flows from homes and businesses, but we're dealing with a huge amount of water that comes very rapidly into our system from the storms. This treatment plant cannot handle that, and in fact, if we were to try and run that flow through the treatment plant, we would probably wash it out. The plant itself is it's a biological and mechanical system, and if we run too much flow through it, all this stuff would just wash right through, and we'd be left with some empty concrete tanks full of well, just water. They would not have the ability to treat that water. There would not be the bacteria to digest the waste and to process it. So we can't run that through the plant. The plant is not big enough, and in fact our system hydraulically is designed to not let that happen. When the plants were put on, what they did was they took this system, which was letting waste go directly to the lake, and up until 1951 that's exactly what happened with 100% of Burlington's waste.
Is that right? Up until 1951, all of Burlington's waste went directly into the lake?
All of it. In fact, the entire state of Vermont, nobody had treatment. We were the first to put any kind of treatment in, so that's the way it was statewide. What we did was, or what they did was, they teed off of this main line and put the plant off to the side there. So the plant takes now the normal daily flow, but as soon as we get a rainstorm, we go back to the pre-1951 condition, and most of the flow goes directly to the lake. It goes out this structure that we see here, which was, as I say, a newer structure compared to the old one. And if we get the right types of wind, water temperature is correct, currents are correct, it ends up flowing along the lakefront in the general direction of North Beach, or with the wind direction being the opposite, it'll flow in a southerly direction down towards Shelburne Bay. One thing we don't know, and something that I am learning more and more each day, is there's very little information on Lake Champlain, and there's no good information on Burlington Bay describing the currents, stratigraphy of the lake, the so-called limnology of the lake. And that was a surprise, and we wanted to find out more about the problem and begin to do planning. We are starting from square one.
Okay, Steve, let me just interrupt you to say, okay, in addition to the problem that you defined, which is a problem I think many of our citizens are aware of, there's also another part of that problem, is that when we have those same rainstorms, we have sewer backup in basements in certain parts of the city. Why don't you describe what areas of the city are hit by that?
Okay. Actually, just to give you an idea of the problem, it's actually the flip side of the same coin. I mentioned that originally we put in a system to handle sanitary flows, and then through some mechanism, people began to hook catch basins on. Not only is it a problem once this flow enters the pipes because the plant can't treat it, but these pipes in many cases just aren't big enough to get this flow to the plant or even to this lake outfall. So what happens is it looks for any other place to back up. It'll flood streets, it'll back up into people's basements or whatever. And this problem is not just associated with the main plant, but development primarily built in the 60s and 50s in the new North End has the same problem. They seem to have put in sewer lines and then attempted to use them as drain lines. So everywhere from well, people on both sides of North Avenue in the new North End, people living on Manhattan Drive area, people down by Lower Pine Street in the South End. I could go on naming areas, but it's not one small neighborhood. Different parts of the city have this problem, and for the most part it is because of undersized pipes that are trying to be used for both sanitary flows and storm flows. They're more than adequate for sanitary, completely inadequate, and it's not even a close call as far as the storm flows are concerned. And slowly but surely we are separating. What I mean by that is putting in...
Let me interrupt you before we get to what we're trying to do. Okay, yeah. I think have we more or less covered what the problem is, or is there anything more you want to add to that?
No, I could just... Well, I don't know if I need to say more about...
Let's talk about the problem, and then we'll talk about how we're trying to address the problem.
Okay, again, what people have to have the concept is, if our system was just a sanitary system, we would actually be in good shape. The fact that somehow it has evolved into a system where massive amounts of stormwater can enter it. That's the heart of the problem, and that causes both the basement backup and the discharges to the lake. And the only other thing to add to that is it is not a new problem, especially in this downtown area. I don't think, if you look back at Burlington's growth over the years, even though things have changed downtown, we don't have areas that were once vacant lots and are now large buildings. Usually what happens is one building is torn down, another one is put up. And it's not the growth so much, it's the fact that we've been doing this since the 1800s, and we're finally addressing it. I don't know how else to make it clearer.
Okay. Okay. So what we are trying to do is describe what the problem is, okay? What is the solution to the problem? How much will it cost? How are we progressing to solve it?
There's different solutions. Unfortunately, we don't have the luxury to go back and rebuild Burlington from the start, and that makes things more difficult, more costly, and it means that we have to take a variety of approaches. In some areas, the easiest thing to do is to provide separation. Take these catch basins, put them on a separate system, and discharge that system entirely separately. In that case, there'd be no sanitary flows, no human waste would be associated with that. We'd be dumping stormwater.
So essentially what you do is accumulating the stormwater on the streets and dumping that directly, and that's reasonably clean. That's basically rainwater.
Well, even stormwater is not of drinking water quality, and I think no one would pretend to say that this is pristine water. On the other hand, compared to the problems and dangers associated with sanitary waste, it's much less of a problem, and in fact the acceptable thing to do in Vermont and almost all over the nation is to dump stormwaters separately and dump them directly without further treatment. There are techniques for that. I don't want to say that in the future, once the sanitary problems are under control, the people will not look toward further treatment, always looking to make it better and treating it to the highest degree that's feasible. But go back to my point that separation solves a lot of the problems. It gets the basement flooding problem solved because no longer do the same lines that handle your sanitary waste from your home have to deal with the catch basins, and there just is no way you're going to have the backups at that point. It also relieves the treatment plant and relieves these combined overflows. You still have discharges, but they aren't sanitary waste. Other areas, though, we don't have that luxury. It's not easy in downtown area, for instance, to come in and just provide these separated lines. The distances from the problem areas to the nearest discharge point are very, very great, and the costs are astronomical, and the area is huge. So what we're looking at there is a combination. There are some separations that we're going to do. Manhattan Drive's a good example of that because...
All right, let me interrupt you again. I want to get back in a chronological order. Okay. Several years ago, in an attempt to begin for the first time in our history to deal in a serious manner with this problem, we passed a very, very large bond issue. Okay, we passed a bond issue which was almost $23 million. Okay, and there are a couple of points that I want to make about the economics of this. All over the country, as communities attempt to deal with basic pollution problems such as this, everybody understands they are extremely expensive. To give the viewers an idea as to how expensive this project is, right now, as many Burlingtonians know, we are making significant improvements on the city streets. For years and years, our streets were deteriorating. We've turned it around, and we're probably over 50% past the mark of improving all of our streets and sidewalks. We've made a lot of progress. The estimate is that in 5 years, to go a long, long way to deal with the problems of our streets and sidewalks, which itself is a very expensive project, to almost do the whole job will cost us $7 million, a lot of money. The project that Steve is talking about and what we are looking at now in order to deal comprehensively with the combined sewer overflow problem is a project which is estimated to cost about $52 million. $52 million, which would make it far and away the most expensive environmental project in the history of the state of Vermont, okay? Steve, let me just jump into that. The other point that I want to add is that when projects are this expensive, okay, historically, or at least since this nation and state have been involved in understanding the importance of protecting our environment, it is understood that one community alone cannot pick up the cost of a $52 million project. If in Burlington, for example, we were to absorb $52 million in cost, wastewater rates would go up so very high that it would be far and away, far and away, the highest rates in the state of Vermont, probably in the country. It would cause a lot of devastation to many people who would have a hard time paying those bills. So what has been understood in the modern history of this country is that clearly you need a partnership between the federal government, the state government, and the local government. And depending on the particular projects, it is not unusual for communities to put 5% of the total in, 10% of the total in, or something like that. The city passed a $23 million bond issue several years ago. Steve, why don't you go from there and talk about how we got to $52 million, and then I can get into the negotiations with the state in a minute.
Okay. Mayor just said, we passed a $22 million bond issue, and at the time, I recall it because I was quite involved in it, and I'm not sure how many people perceive it, but there was a larger number that was talked about at the time. What we had was a $22 million bond issue, which was designed to solve certain specific problems. We wanted to work on the basement flooding. We wanted to make sure that our treatment plants were modern, efficient, and running well. And then a third thing was to allow for growth if that growth was likely to occur. The other number that we had, though, we had an engineering study done on it, was what we could do about the CSOs, the combined sewer overflows. And we had a number developed by our engineers of about a $20 million project. In other words, we were looking at about $42 million, and if you threw in all the contingencies and the other work, you were probably very, very close to $50 million even then. At that point, it was quite clear, as the mayor's already said, though, there's no way the city is going to vote a $50 million bond issue to deal with that, because there was no way the city could afford or would want to afford the rates that would be associated with it. So what we did was we had a lot of discussions with the state. We realized that there were certain things that we were going to have to fund and were not going to be fundable through any state or federal grants, but other things, including the CSO work, the indication was would be fundable, and in fact, the state would be gearing up in the near future to do just that. So we put forth a $23 million bond issue for the things that we thought we would have to handle ourselves, and we set aside for a short term until the state funding came around the major CSO work. Now what's happened, and things always seem to change, the state program is changing in part because they have changed their philosophy, and in part because the federal law which funds it and where the state derives most of its funds has also changed. We're not now looking at an indefinite flow of money, and we don't have the luxury of waiting a few years to get the CSO work done. The federal government is going to eliminate all grants within 5 years, and in fact they're going to phase them out over the next 5 years. Our new public works director came on board and very correctly noted that if we don't push very hard for the CSO work now, it's going to be now or never. We have gone back, put together a comprehensive plan that includes the CSO work, the treatment plant work, the separation work, all in one package. It's called the facilities plan. And that facilities plan now has this $53 million price tag associated with it. That's how it's evolved. It isn't as if it's the first time it's been thought of, but you can only do so much, and you can't get blood out of a stone. Initially, we thought we could afford to wait a short term and that plenty of federal money would be around. Now that doesn't look like that's likely, at least for the long term, so we're working very hard in the short term to take advantage of what's there now, and there is a $53 million tag on it at this stage.
Okay, Steve, if we receive the $53 million check tomorrow, okay, and we began work, exactly what will we accomplish?
Like all projects, there's a lot of engineering that has to take place. Some of it is fairly far along, some of it is not very advanced. Certain things like the separation work, we're ready to go on that. And if we had the money now, we would start that work. Actually, in this case, we'd probably start it in the springtime. There's no sense in
where exactly would we start the work?
Major parts of it, in fact, the major piece is in the new north end. That's where separation is most practical, and the largest segment of the system would go in there. There's also a very large section in the Manhattan Drive area, and then there's smaller sections around the city. There's smaller pieces. One major thing, at least in impact, would be we have an outfall not only standing behind us right here, but there's one a little further up at College Street. It's not as large. Its impact is probably not as great, but we're going to consolidate those outfalls and bring them near the treatment plant. So another major piece would be to bring the College Street overflow and the Main Street into one location where they can be handled. That type of work, or at least most of the separation work, that not included, is ready to go. The treatment plant upgrades are a little bit more complex. The main treatment plant upgrade not only involves treating for sanitary waste, but it also is going to involve some type of a treatment system for the combined sewer overflows. What we're looking at now, and since there's a million different schemes on this, we have come up with one scheme that we think is the most cost-effective, but we are going to give it one more look-see. Basically what we're going to do is provide at least what we call a first flush treatment, or primary treatment to all storm flows, except those that are the 1 in 50-year storm. You could never design for that. It would cost you way more than you could spend. At this facility, we will be adding on certain components that would allow that to happen, so that all waste that comes in, whether during a storm or, well, during a storm, will at least receive primary treatment, and during normal conditions like we have now, of course, it will get the secondary treatment. The east plant and the north plant are a little simpler. Those are basically modernizing, upgrading, improving facilities, and there isn't a lot of study to be done with those. Those will move to engineering in the near future. But the main plan, I can reiterate, we've got to look at this thing one more time and make sure, even though we have a facilities plan, it's never too late to do something better and to learn from the latest technology, which we're almost daily accumulating information on. The other thing that's of interest in the main plant is the outfall that discharges from the plant during normal conditions is not that much further from this combined outfall. It's literally a stone's throw from where we're standing. It's underwater, so you can't see it. That outfall also is not a great situation. It's treated waste, but it has the same problems as this one, only on a smaller scale. When we put this first flush capability in, and now everything goes through the plant, we no longer want to use this outfall close to shore. We want to move it. It's not a great location. It's got to go somewhere else. We're looking at that now. Our first thought was to move it out beyond the breakwater somewhere. We're having some studies done. I don't see anyone out there today, but they have been out. The firm of Aquatech and the University of Vermont Natural Resources Research Center are both working on studies for us that describe how the lake in Burlington Harbor functions. If we, for instance, if we discharge at point A, where's it going to flow? Where are we going to find this material a few days later? We don't want to find it on our beaches. We don't want to find it on our shorefront. We don't want to find it in our water intakes. So that study is ongoing right now. We'll have pretty good information on that in a couple months. That has to be incorporated into the design. And at this point, it may not only involve moving the wastewater outfall, but it may also involve somehow moving the water intakes to optimize what we do. In fact, it's easier to move the water intakes than it is to move the outfall, and it may turn out that a combination of the two is the best solution. So, while we have a plan, this is as much art as it is science, and we're always studying what the alternatives are. And the way designs work, you go from a preliminary stage where you're looking at things from a feasibility aspect. Then you do further study, and finally, when you get into the design, you're working with the minute details of it, and there's always a possibility that something new can come up, some design problem that you could not have anticipated earlier. It's an ongoing process, so people should expect that even the plan we have now is not cast in concrete. And if we learn something as far as an improved technique or a better way to do something, or a way that we have to do it differently because our original plan is not going to work out, we're prepared to change and to modify our plans.
Okay, what I want to discuss for a little bit is the financial implications of the program. Actually, before I do that, Steve, I want to ask you, we have a facilities plan now which will enable us to start moving forward as quickly as we can next construction season. Is that correct?
Exactly. The facilities plan it's a legal requirement. It can be changed, as I say, but without it, we weren't eligible for any funding at all, in the sense that we really need that funding. So now that plan, it's not approved by EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, yet. Within a week, we expect it to be approved.
Okay. And what will that mean for construction next season?
Well, the main things that we're ready to construct, actually, most of the design is complete now. So we're ready and raring to go on that. The big thing is the money there in the form that we want it? We hope it is. And
okay. But what I mean is, where would we actually see work next construction season?
You'll see major work in the new North End and Manhattan Drive next year. And there may be some small little spattering some other places, but we'll spend $8, $9, $10 million in those areas next year.
Okay. My understanding is that if the money were not a problem, we had the money today, it would be what, 4 or 5 year project?
For everything, including the treatment plants, I think that's what people have to anticipate. There's a lot of design work that goes into this. There is still further study on the lake that's involved in it. But there would be some very visible things that would take place right away. For instance, the separation work, by the end of next summer, you'd see some very visible results from that. So it isn't 5 years till we see something begin to improve. It will start in increments, and I think you could anticipate a 5-year schedule.
Okay, the one point that I want to reiterate, I've gotten a number of letters from people, and I think people are rightfully very concerned, the people of Burlington and the people of the state of Vermont are very concerned about what's happening, and I think we have become more conscious of the environment in general, and we all understand. I think you got to be a moron not to understand that this lake is clearly the most important resource that the people in this entire region have, and perhaps throughout the entire state of Vermont. The good news, and I think it is good news, the good news is that I think the state of Vermont is beginning to fully understand the problem that exists here. And I think that during the last several months, we have had some very positive negotiations with the state in terms of framing a city-state partnership which will financially implement the feasibility, the facilities plan that Steve was talking about. Now, what does that mean? What it means is, obviously, from the city's point of view, the city cannot afford to spend $52 million without driving many of the people, moderate and low-income people, literally out of the city because of skyrocketing wastewater bills. There has to be a partnership. The state understands that. What we are talking about, again, is an extraordinarily expensive project, far and away the most expensive environmental project in the history of the state of Vermont. During the last couple of months, I and other people in the administration have been meeting with representatives from state government, Mr. Menson, who's the Secretary of Administration, Mr. Lash, who's the Secretary of the Natural Resources Agency, and other people, environmental people, in trying to work out a mechanism which financially could be acceptable to the city and to the state so that we could develop a $52 million package so that we could begin work as we intend to next construction season. Okay, and the truth of the matter is that this is a very complicated issue, but my gut tells me that the discussions are going well, that both parties want to solve the problem. So that while we do not have a package yet, and we'll be meeting again actually next week to see where we're at. There are the financial discussions going on that have been going on in Boston, going on here. My strong belief is that we are going to have a financial package ready to take to the legislature, that you are going to have the state of Vermont and the city of Burlington working together, and you're also going to have an understanding, by the way, that this combined sewer overflow problem is not just a Burlington problem. It's a problem that other communities have that the state of Vermont wants to address from one end of the state to the other. So I think we are making significant progress on it, and I think that what we are going to have is the solution to this problem within a couple of years. And I know people want the problem solved tomorrow. It's not going to be solved tomorrow. It is just too complicated and too expensive, and it's going to take us a number of years. Hard to say. I don't know. Max, the whole thing should be done within 5 years, and incrementally, as you indicate, we'll see improvements every single year. Okay, and in fact, we have already seen improvements. The ravine sewer.
Ravine sewer helps that part of town. There has been some improvement in the Pine Street, Home Avenue area, and we're still working on that this year. Those are small improvements. I think next year, since the scope of the work is so much larger, the areas affected, you'll see some dramatic improvements there.
I think the main point that I want to make, A, an enormously expensive project, the most expensive in the history of the state. B, work has already begun. Some improvements have been made. C, next year we should see some substantial improvements. D, if the financial package is worked out, that I'm confident will be worked out between the city and state, this problem, after years, after decades of allowing this lake to be abused, if you will, in an environmental way, is finally going to be solved once and for all. So I think, you know, obviously we're several decades too late, but it is a concern that all of us have. We are making progress on it, and it is going to be solved. Steve, just want to thank you very much. I know that you and George Crombie and your department and the consultants that we've hired and the people from the state are working very hard on the issue, and I want to thank you very much.